This is our 14th annual Morton Deutsch Award for Distinguished Contributions to Social Justice. So Morton Deutsch, who many of you knew and loved in his time on this earth, really sort of rocked the field of social justice. He liked to claim that he was born prematurely. He was born months early, and he was basically early for everything else in his life. He went to school at like, I don't know, 14 or something ridiculous. Went to university at like 14 and graduated early. So he was always young, Jewish, and sort of ahead of his time in the Bronx in the 20s and 30s. So he had a direct experience of anti-Semitism and oppression and injustice. And that drove a lot of his thinking. He liked to claim when he was 5 years old and he was at a baseball game with older kids and they wouldn't let him play, that was one of his first really visceral experiences of social injustice. So he picked up the ball and he threw it in the woods for his own sort of reparations. He later organized a group of busboys to strike at a resort that he was working at in the Catskills, and so was the beginning of his work in social justice. But he really affected scholarship in this area with the publication of a series of articles that he published in the 70s. One was called Awakening the Sense of Injustice, which is extremely relevant today. And then another called Equity, Equality, and Need in 1975, which ultimately culminated in his groundbreaking book, Distributive Justice, A Social Psychological Perspective. Those articles caused a lot of trouble because he decided to sort of take on the leading theory at the time of social justice, which was equity theory, and he completely deconstructed it, disoriented the field, infuriated a lot of people, and then reinvigorated this area of scholarship and brought a lot of passion and insight into the future of social justice work. And he really continued to kind of agitate and study in this area for the rest of his life. And then in 2002, he sort of came into the center as he was wanted to do the Morton Deutsch Center. And he said, you know, this increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots that exists in our community, in our society, in our city, and scaling across the world is unacceptable. And yet we really need to take that issue seriously. And so he convened a group of us, including Susan Apatow and Michelle Fine and Eric Marcus and some other people possibly who are here, and said, let's take this seriously and let's have a study group. So some faculty and former students gathered for a couple of years, and we read everything we could and many of the things he recommended to try to understand injustice, a persistence of oppression. And our sense was that there was really good research in sort of characterizing why these problems are so hard to crack, why they're so intact, but there was less insight into what to do to interrupt them. How do you change these dynamics? How do you really then sustain those changes? And so there was less important work in that area. So we started to think and write in that area. And one of the things that happened is we organized this great conference with activists and academics and students on interrupting social justice, and interrupting oppression and sustaining social justice. I want to get that right. And part of what came out of that was this event. It was really his idea and our joint conversation to really incentivize, recognize, and celebrate distinguished scholarship and practice in social justice, and then to incentivize young students to, again, take this seriously intellectually and practically. And so that's really what we're here today to do, is honor that insight at that time and what we've now done for 14 years. So this, oh wow, there's another picture of Mort. And there's our speakers, but I don't think we have the other slides up. So, oh well. But I do want to say that in the last 14 years, we've had some extraordinary recipients of the Distinguished Scholar-Practitioner Award. Michelle Fine, I think, was our first recipient. Jeffrey Canada has been a recipient. Gene Sharp, who is noted for his lifelong work in nonviolent strategies. So there have been many extraordinary actors, including Gerald Wing Sue, who is here today, who was last year's recipient. And so we've had extraordinary distinguished scholar practitioners and students as well, and that legacy will continue today. I want to say that we'll begin the presentation this year I'll introduce Daniela Kuhn, who will then introduce the student speaker, the student recipient of the award this year, and then she'll give some comments on her prize-winning paper. And then following that, I'll introduce our scholar practitioner this year, Dr. James M. Jones, who will present his work briefly and then engage in a bit of a dialogue with Daryl Wing-Sue on the importance of his work moving forward. I guess one other thing I just want to do is I want to recognize the organizers and volunteers for this. So Rosella Garcia and the TC alumni staff and the ICCCR staff, who are all here somewhere, I think, or maybe they're outside working. But thank them, please, for organizing this. And then I'll bring up Daniela Kuhn, who is the Associate Director of the MD-ICCCR, who's helped basically organize the faculty group that chose this paper. Thanks, Daniela.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am pleased to introduce this year's recipient of the award for the Distinguished Graduate Student Paper on Social Justice. The call for student papers was open to all TC and Columbia students. Topics for these papers ranged from the paradox of human rights education, to looking at young professionals with DACA status, to the lived experiences of LGBTQ refugees in the Middle East and North Africa. The submissions were received from a broad array of programs here at TC and Columbia: the International Educational Development Department, International and Public Affairs, Clinical Psychology, Negotiation and Conflict Resolution, Development Practice, and Sustainability Management. We are grateful to our judges who dedicated their limited spare time to carefully reading, reviewing, and providing valuable feedback on all of the papers. We'd like to thank Claudia Cohen, an associate adjunct professor with the social organizational program here at Teachers College. Thank you, Claudia. As well as Jose Pascal da Rocha, a faculty member and lecturer with the master's program on negotiation and conflict resolution at Columbia University, as well as Zachary Metz, who's an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs at SIPA, who I think might also be here. No. The papers were impressive, wide-ranging, and quite enjoyable to read. They were evaluated on a number of dimensions, including a sound analysis of the problem in existing literature, innovative recommendations or solutions, and their general contributions to scholarship, practice, and policy. The papers were reviewed anonymously, and the feedback was given to each student. We are pleased to continue to honor Morton's legacy by drawing more attention to scholarly and practical work in the area of social justice through the celebration of this promising student work. Our winner this year, Daniela Romero-Amaya, is a doctoral fellow in the Social Studies Education program here at TC. She holds a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in international educational development. Her research interests are related to history education, citizenship education, and youth civic participation in conflict-affected contexts. Daniela conducted teacher training in Bhopal, India as a summer intern for the Earth Institute here at Columbia in 2015. Prior to starting her Ph.D. program, she worked in a semi-rural school in Haiti doing teacher training and developing an inclusion program for more than 60 students with special needs in the same school. She is currently conducting research on young citizens' meanings and understandings of the armed conflict in Colombia, as well as their engagement in the current peace process. And now, Daniela will provide an overview of her winning paper.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know there are a lot of sessions going on right now in parallel, but thanks for coming to this one. I feel the pressure of time because I know we're behind, so I'm going to try my best to present my paper called Empty Schools and Silencios, Pedagogical Openings for Memory Making in Colombia. I also want to thank the jury for selecting this paper. I take this as an opportunity not only to talk about this paper, but to raise awareness about what's going on in Colombia right now. We're under a peace process. We're implementing the peace agreements with FARC. However, since 2016, more than 200 social leaders have been murdered. So we are in this liminal stage of not in war, yet in peace. So this is really important, and I take this as a privileged moment to talk to a larger audience, to an international audience, and raise awareness about this. Nope, that one, no. Silencio con agrieta, or silence with a crack. This is one of the more than 120 images that Juan Manuel Echavarria, a Colombian photographer, has been taking in Los Montes de Maria, Colombia. Los Montes de Maria is located in the northern part of the country, and this area is recognized because it has been very affected by conflict. The presence of different armed groups, left-wing armed groups, right-wing paramilitary forces, army, have been prevalent in that area. What we know as ghost towns or pueblos fantasmas are very known in that area, meaning that people were forcibly displaced to abandon their houses and their towns, and they have been forced to start their lives in other settings. As you can see in that image, that's how those ghost towns look like. Oh, sorry. This is Juan Manuel Echavarria, the photographer. He was invited in 2010 to commemorate the forced displacement of one of these communities in Mampuhan. While he was there, he was taking some pictures, and after that, he went to Bogota to reveal these images. He was really shocked when he realized that on the chalkboard, there was a message written, "Lo bonito es estar vivo." The beautiful thing is to be alive. He was really shocked because he realized that probably the last person who was in front of that chalkboard has written a message of beauty among war, saying the beautiful thing is to be alive. Then he decided to start this project and taking pictures of all these abandoned schools across Colombia. When I interviewed him, he said this sentence that stuck with me. These schools are witnesses of the horror that a community experienced. They're witnesses of war. You don't see a dead person, but you can see the story behind. These chalkboards have lessons to tell us about war. From that message that he was telling me, I took it as the starting point to start working on this paper, precisely on the lessons that these images have to tell us about war. I identified 3 memory sites, what Pierre Nora mentions as memory sites. The first one is the space, the material part of it, the chalkboard, the school, the town. The second one is the event, the commemoration, that gathering, collective gathering to remember what has happened to that community 10 years before. And the last one, the photography itself, silencios as a visual memory site. But as Andreas Huysen mentioned, like the past is not only out there in people's memories or out there in traces that we can see or that we can touch, but they have to be articulated, socially and politically articulated in order to become memories. So within that understanding, I take pedagogy of witnessing, Simon's approach, to take silencios and to explore what are the potential pedagogical options that it offers to us. I take their testimonial character, the testimonial character of silencios, to explore the stories that they tell. As Susan Sontag mentioned, photography does not offer an interpretation in itself. It offers us a frame that we can use to build our own interpretations. It demands our own participation and an own engagement in order to draw that interpretation. So pedagogy of witnessing is about a transformative mode of looking. This is moving the public from expectating, just having that passive contemplation, that passive gaze, and moving it to be witnesses of what we're looking, of that discomfort, interpolation of the self, that discomfort inquiry about the relationships that we have with others. It's about de-essentializing identity and de-essentializing memories. Simon mentions it as the touch of the past, a shock to thought, and a call to action. So these images are fruitfulness if we don't produce a call to action, if there is nothing that moves us to do something. Particularly right now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are under a current process. So we as citizens, as Colombian citizens, what are we doing and how are we participating in that process? Beckerman and Sembilos recognize that the power of dangerous memories are very important in the peace-building stage, because they reject the one truth that traditionally governments try to impose as only one way to interpret the past and only one way to make meaning of what has happened in societies. These are openings, meaning those are opportunities for achieving socio-political transformation. And then the question is like, can we talk about endurable peace within that framework? I'm getting the cue of time. So I'm going to finish with this last image, silencio atrapado, or silence stuck. And I do argue that silencios are very loud noises, are visual noises that are calling us to action, that are resisting to oblivion, are resisting to war. And this is, I'll invite you to write a paper. Hopefully they're going to post it in the website. Thank you very much.
It's in two pieces. Well, I apologize for being so rushed this morning, and I do encourage you to read Daniela's paper, which will be hosted on the center's website later today. I am struck by your content, Daniela, and I'm struck by a couple of things. That Colombia, as many of you know, is undergoing a peace process. There has been a transition to a more peaceful Colombia, which is the first time in 50 years that there's been no active war on this side of the world. So that's an extraordinary thing, and it is an opportunity now to move forward and to take seriously the damage done and to try to repair. And these types of sort of ruptures to the status quo, a transition to peace, or the ruptures to the status quo that we're experiencing in our society today with the divisiveness and the hostile rhetoric. These are sometimes, ironically, opportunities for mobilization of social justice and mobilization and recognition of important work that's being done. And then there's another side of social justice, which is the long run. It is the hard, incremental work that takes place every day and for decades. And I want to say that our distinguished scholar practitioner of this year, Dr. James M. Jones, I think is someone who, for his career, has worked tirelessly to advance an agenda of social justice and to provide opportunities and support and structures for many others to do the same type of work. Dr. Jones is Trustees Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Psychological and Brain Sciences and Black American Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Diversity at the University of Delaware. He was also the first executive director for public interest at the American Psychological Association, and during his tenure there, established offices on HIV/AIDS, ethnic minority affairs, Aging, LGBT, and Stress in the Workplace, and was director of the Minority Fellowship Program at APA for 28 years, during which time over 1,500 fellows of color earned their PhDs. And I think that's the kind of work that builds our infrastructure for the future. Dr. Jones earned his BA from Oberlin, his MA from Temple, and his PhD in social psychology from Yale University. He was a faculty member on the notorious, in the Psychology and Social Relations Department at Harvard University, which is well-renowned in our world, and is taught in the Psych Department at Howard University. He published the first edition of Prejudice and Racism in 1972, and the second edition again in 97. In his most recent book, The Psychology of Diversity Beyond Prejudice and Racism, with Jack DeVideo and Deborah Vitze, was published in 2014. He serves on several editorial boards, past president of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology and SPICY, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, has many awards, 99 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of the Psychological Study of Ethnicity, Culture, and Race, 2001 Kurt Lewin Award, which is near and dear to our hearts, the 2009 Distinguished Service Award by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, 2007 Distinguished Psychologist Award by the Association of Black Psychologists, 2011 Lifetime Contribution to Psychology from APA. The list goes on, but then culminates in today, where he is the 2018 Morton Deutsch Award for Distinguished Contributions to Social Justice from the Morton Deutsch Center. So please join me in celebrating and welcoming Dr. James Jones.
Good afternoon. I'm really surprised. I didn't know there'd be this many people here. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate that. I have 10 minutes. So obviously I'll have to be judicious in what I choose to talk about. I do have an opportunity to chat with Daryl a little bit afterwards, so that may fill in some of the things I leave out. I am very honored, I'm remarkably honored, surprised, frankly, by this award. It's not something that I think about. Social justice is not kind of a label that I have had. I just do what I do and see what needs to be done and try to make a difference in the context that I'm in. And I've been doing it for a long time, so a lot of things happen over a long period of time. So I'm very honored to have this. Morton Deutsch, when I was in graduate school, Mort was an iconic figure. His work on cooperation and competition is classic. I still, Acme and Bolt, you know. It's just so powerful. And he was able to put that into a context that allowed us to really explore, both in terms of its practical implications, in terms of the scientific analytics of how we do things and what we're motivated by and what affects what we do. Is very, very powerful. So I've been very, very humbled by this award. I have a, how do I do this? It just occurs to me, I don't know what I'm doing. What do I press? Do I use this?
Good question. No one really knows, but let's try. Let me see if I can figure it out. That's not what you press. That's what you
Okay,
press.
so what did you press?
So this button.
Okay. So, a scholar-practitioner. So I'm going to talk briefly about the practitioner part. I may or may not get to the scholar part, but Daryl and I can chat about that. So there are three things during my time at APA that I thought were significant. The first and most significant in a social justice way was as a convener of the Dulles Conference in 1978. The Dulles the second thing was being director of the Minority Fellowship Program, as Peter said, for 28 years. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then as the executive director for public interest when it was conceived in 1987, for 4 years to 1991. I want to talk just a little bit about that. I've got to keep going. I want to, this isn't working. Oh, it went backwards. There's something happened. Okay, got it. So, okay, I'm starting with the Minority Fellowship Program, I guess. No, I didn't start with the minority. I shouldn't. There we go. All right. So, in 1978, APA was characteristically, like all of psychology, pretty much governed by kind of the tradition of the Anglo-European males, for the most part. Unlike SPICY, Jews hadn't really had such a big role at APA. And when I took over as Minority Fellowship Program Director, I inherited a small grant from NIMH with some contribution from APA to hold a conference on how can APA and psychology become more responsive to issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture. So, needless to say, we didn't know exactly how we were going to do that and how to organize it and plan it. But I can't go through all the details, but let me just say that in that backdrop, we invited 3 or 4 or 5 representatives of each of the ethnic minority psychological associations to come to this conference. And the agenda for the conference was, what do we want from APA? What should APA do to be responsive to us as a community, as psychologists, as scholars, as people? So we had a 2.5-day conference. We had sessions, we had discussions, people talked. We tried to be very open to let people participate. And there were some differences of opinion across the groups. But what ultimately happened was we made a proposal that started a chain of events that has led to a completely different association, a substantially different profession, and a way in which people who are trained as psychology have contributed to the well-being and welfare of this citizenship, this nation, our citizens. And I'm extremely proud of that. And the way I think of the Dulles Conference is as a catalytic event that produced sustainable evolutionary outcomes. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to have that kind of event at a moment in time when it's ripe. A neighbor of mine used to talk about ripeness for international negotiation. When it's ripe, you got to seize it, and you've got to make the move, make the decision, make the commitment that makes the 5 minutes already. Okay, so conflict and resolution. This is kind of one of my favorite stories. What happened was that one of the differences of opinion was what kind of representation should we have on any kind of body that would represent ethnic minorities. And so at the moment, at that time, we were talking about American Indians, Asian Americans, blacks, and Hispanics. And there were 2 models on the table. One model was what some of the participants called the senatorial model, 2 from each group. The other model was from the black group saying, I don't care how many we have, but they're going to be more blacks than anybody else. So how do we adjudicate that? We had summits and conferences. We had to push APA off before we could get together and come up with it. But we came up with a compromise, which was that there would be 11 members, 4 black, 3 Hispanic, and 2 each Asian and American Indian. That was the compromise. And it's important because what it says is if you want to try to work together, you want to try to reach mutually acceptable outcomes, you have to negotiate, but you also have to recognize that things happen over time and that the outcomes are not necessarily right versus wrong. We're trying to get APA to do right, but it's sometimes you have positive, desirable ideas that are in conflict with one another. So how do you resolve that? And to me, that's one of the biggest challenges we face. How do we go for things that we want when going for one may compromise another? And that, to me, is kind of the diversity issue that we talk about, because diversity is a bunch of difference, and how do we satisfy all these at the same time? You have to have a different calculus to get at that. So what ultimately happened is that from 78 to now, we have the Office of Ethnic Minority Affairs, the APA. We changed the APA's central office. We had the Board of Ethnic Minority Affairs, which became a central part of the governance. We have developed somewhat later the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, Division 45, which is another form of representation. We formulated the Multicultural Summit, which is a biennial event in which multicultural psychology is at the forefront, and its leaders and its issues are regularly discussed and advanced. And we have a scientific journal of cultural diversity and ethnic minority psychology, and we're now infiltrating. It's not surreptitious, but we are heavily involved in the governance of APA through the board of directors, through the Council of Representatives, and our current president is an African-American woman. Our past president is a Latino man. Our president-elect is an African-American woman. Melba Vasquez was president a couple of years ago, and she was a recipient of the fellowship. And Dick Swin was the first, I think, no, that's not true. Kenneth Clark was the first person of color who was president. And then Dick Swin more recently. So anyway, that is to say, all that is, I think, in all modesty, a consequence of the Dulles Conference. And it tells us that whatever we're doing, whatever our action is, we have to think about what kind of event can have that kind of catalytic influence on the trajectory of the issues that we care about. Now I have to go, I'm going the wrong way. The MF Minority Fellowship Program I did for 28 years. Obviously, I can't talk about it in a minute and a half. But I will just talk about the strategy, which was to identify and select strongly committed people, to empower them, to create a family. And this is very important to the Minority Fellowship Program. We created a family over time that people really were peer mentored, they grew with each other, they related to each other, and they really have a network that goes over time and across the country. And we help them to participate in professional development, which is not part of a typical graduate training program, but we created professional development opportunities for them to be better prepared to perform. And then we have recognition. We honored them. We honored them for their contributions and their success. Wade Boykin is here. He's one of our advisory committee members. Daryl was, I think, early on. The advisory committee of distinguished psychologists of color are very much a part of that network and that family. And so that whole experience created an infrastructure, a network that has continued to function effectively for a long time. I can't talk about institutional change, but remember at the time there were very little courses, very few faculty, very few students of color. And so we were really walking into a wilderness. And it's very different now. I can tell you that. I'm sure you experienced that. It's very different now across the whole spectrum of issues. But let me just talk about the impact on psychology with respect to, you've heard about the 1500. Our fellows have been and are presidents of universities. Beverly Tatum was President Spelman. Anne-Marie Kause is currently president of the University of Washington. Isaiah Crawford is president of the University of Seattle. I just learned that Thomas Parham is incoming president at Dominguez Hills in California. We've had provosts, deans, chairs. We have a MacArthur Fellow, members of the National Academy of Sciences. It's really impressive. And what's really impressive is we selected people because of their identity and their commitment to social justice issues. So we have created this phalanx, I hate to use military sorts of concepts, but anyway, this group of people who are spread across the country who are making the kinds of contributions that change the landscape of people's. Oh, I forgot Michael Brown. He is the chancellor of the University of California system. Forgot about him. So we're making a difference, and that's part of the Minority Fellowship Program and a consequence of the Minority Fellowship Program, which I was privileged to be part of for such a long time. Am I going it wrong? Yep. Oh, okay. My time is up, I know. So I just, as Executive Director for Public Interest, we really brought science to social justice issues. So I just highlight here, we did a special issue of the American Psychologist in 1988 on HIV and AIDS. At that time, we knew nothing much about it. We were scared of it. There wasn't much science, but what science there was, psychologists by and large were doing it. In 1991, we did a special issue on homelessness. Again, that was shortly after they kicked people out of mental health facilities and created a big homelessness problem. We did a special issue and challenged the government to do better. We actually made a special volume and gave it to Jack Kemp, who was then Secretary of HUD, which oversaw the homelessness issue. And we had some contention with them about what they were doing and that their policies were really creating the problem, not solving it. So anyway, public interest has been very important, and abortion was one that we published an article in Science about abortion when people were talking about how bad it was for women and and as bad it was for families, and the data just didn't really support that. So I'm going to probably have to stop. She asked, maybe we'll talk about some of my scholarly contributions later, but she asked me to talk, Danielle asked me to talk about or mention what are some pressing issues, and this cannot be too much of a surprise, but inequality is really a substantial issue. And I mean inequality across a wide spectrum of dimensions. Economic inequality, that's an average change in income over about, what, a 25-year period. And you can see that no one is doing well except the top 1%, and to a lesser extent, the next 20%. So the disparities are growing, and that's part of the problem. If you overlay that with growing population differences and mass incarceration, all the other things that are going on, the kinds of inequalities that we see are really mammoth. And so I think the kind of movements that we're seeing on a regular basis are beginning to lead to, I think, one of those catalytic moments that will really change the trajectory of the future. Population polarization is another, I use that just sort of as a general representation of the divisions that exist in our society that come from many different things, but mostly they come from people having substantially different experiences, and those experiences are not understood between and among groups. So as a result, people are not able to really talk to each other, to understand each other. They have different values and different experiences, so that's really a problem. And then, and finally, what I call the diversity challenge. We have all this diversity. We talk about diversity. We talk about inclusion. We talk about equity. But it's such a complex and thorny problem. We really don't know how to really start. We think if there's a solution. There's not a solution. There's just process. And process that moves us further and further along and reduces the negative and increases the positive. So that's what I think we are faced with. And running through all of this, I would say, is racism. Racism is an abundant, persistent problem. And the fact that we have really, the keynote speech earlier talked about our civic mindedness and our civic education being so inadequate to deal with the kinds of problems we have in a democracy. So our democracy has to become more educated about what it means to be a democracy and what it means to have people who are very different function in a democracy where we talk and have talked about individual rights and individual freedoms. Yeah, we have those, but there are other responsibilities that a civic society requires, and I think we need to really take that on and make that a priority. So I'll stop.
So why don't you have a seat over there?
Okay.
So Dr. Jones, thank you for illustrating for us an exemplary strategy for catalytic leadership over the long term in service of social justice. It brings it to life. So Dr. Gerald Wing Su, who many of you know, who is a colleague at Teachers College, who was last year's recipient of this award, was kind enough to agree to engage in a conversation. So Daniela, how much time do we have, or can we buy?
About 5 minutes.
So we'll say 10 to 15 minutes or so. All right, very good.
And Danielle, can you give us some indication? You know, once again, James, congratulations on the award. It's well deserved. One thing I'd like to make a comment about your work, James. In 1969, I got my doctorate in counseling psychology, and one of my cohorts was A.J. Franklin, and we were taught a Western European universal aspect of what mental health practice was all about. And as a graduate student, I was never taught things like diversity, multiculturalism. We talked about race, but it was on an intellectual level. And I remember that I knew something was wrong. And in 1972, I came across 2 books. One of them I'm not sure if you're familiar with, Thomas and Sillen's book on racism and psychiatry. And when I read it, it just struck this responsive chord. But there was not a grounding that I felt. They talked about scientific racism, but it wasn't. It was when I came across your book in 1972, Prejudice and Racism, in which you distinguish between individual, institutional, and cultural racism. And it really took off in my thinking, and I think in the field of counseling and psychotherapy. And can you in some way share with the audience personal and professional factors that led you to the study of racism, diversity, and these particular areas?
Sure.
The response has to be longer, James.
I'm mindful of the time. Very, very quickly, I was asked as a graduate student to write a book about prejudice. And I said, okay. And the book, and when I thought about prejudice and I read the literature and thought about it, psychologists deal with the individual and deal with the individual framework and experience and attitudes. And I was at Yale, so we had, attitudes was our thing. And I thought, well, this is 1970. We've just had the riots. We've had the Kerner Report. We've had the new book by Carmichael and Hamilton on institutional racism. And so I'm thinking, the real problem is really bigger than individual minds, individual attitudes, whether they're bigoted or not. And so I wanted to talk about institutional stuff, and I wanted to talk about racism. So essentially, the book I was supposed to write was about prejudice, but the book I wrote was about prejudice and racism. So I added that piece. But the cultural piece was really based on my feeling that so much of what affected people of color and Black people in particular was the values and the standards and the images that defined what it meant to be a successful American. And those images and values were very, I wouldn't say they're foreign, but they were ugly for us, because they said, you don't possess these things. And so we were in a position of either having to reject them outright or somehow try to contour our culture, our psyches to these values of beauty, of speech, of dress, of religion, all those things. So I felt that as long as you have this kind of cultural hegemony that defines what is good and right and proper and successful, then everybody who is not part of that is going to be victimized by it. So I ended up talking about individual, institutional, and cultural racism because I thought all of them were important to understanding individual psyches. It's not enough just to do a little attitude test and show that some people give more biased answers than other people. We're all part of this infrastructure of evolved sense of what race is, what correctness is, and we all have it in our brains to some extent. The whole implicit bias revolution is really about how all those things are connected in our brain and how they manifest when we give you an opportunity to express them. So in my mind, the implicit associations test is just a good example of how institutional, individual, and cultural racism converge.
You know, what is the harmful impact that you have observed with all these messages that are being delivered culturally and societally to people of color?
Well, there are a couple of them. One of them is confusion. Confusion by people of color are as American and as committed to America and committed to being good citizens as anybody and better than most. Yet they are they are portrayed as if they are lesser than, and that they're lacking in very basic dimensions of human capacity that make for being a good American. And I think we are remarkably patient, and I think Black people for 400 years have been remarkably patient and have chipped away remarkably well at this society and created opportunities for themselves that they get begrudgingly. Persons from Asia have had to deal with policies that restrict them, imprison them, all the rest of it over a long period of time, and they continue to grow, and they may not be model minorities, but they are indeed very substantial citizens of this country. And so you can go on and on. I think that those images really are confusing because how much of who you are is based in being an American and having to follow the dictates of what it means to be an American, how you become successful, and how much of it is overcoming those obstacles that we all know are there, and how much of it is staying true to yourself, staying true to your culture, representing your culture, and expressing it without limitation and without hesitation. So those things all come together in people, and I think it's not always easy to have to choose one over the other. They're all sort of true. And so how do you deal with that? I think that's what I mean by the confusion.
You know, several years ago, I was watching the replication by Anderson Cooper of the Kenneth Clark studies on doll identification, and they continue to this current day when Black kids are asked, the good doll, the bad doll, which one is most like you, they continue to respond very negatively to Blackness and attribute positive aspects to. Have we changed much since then?
Well, the doll studies are very, very important, but they're also very complicated. The times in the early 50s were such that the argument was that separate but equal was illegal. And the whole purpose of that work was to show that separate but equal is inherently wrong. And so the dolls really became a good way to do that. The fact is that it's not clear whether the preference for the dolls was really real preferences or simply reflecting the society that they understood around them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably even more true now than in the past. So I don't accept the general premise that if you choose the white doll, you're choosing it because you hate yourself. self-hatred is way overrated. I think we need to understand, that's why I talk about the confusion. There's a lot of complexity inside these heads. And as my colleague Richard Schrader says, culture and psyche make each other up. And the fact is that you can't talk about psyche without talking about the culture. Mm-hmm. And I think they try to embed ideas about psyche in the minds of these little kids. I think it's much more complicated than that. So we're trying to unpack, as you suggested, I unpacked 1997 book, unpack some of these complex issues and really learn from them. And I think the only way you can do that is to have people on the inside and the outside who are interiorize the psychology of it and see it from afar and who want to be helpful, hopefully, and figure it out. It's not going to just happen. You got to figure it out. And you've got to figure out how to deal with being gay and black and a woman. Mm-hmm. As just intersection, I think, is one of the big issues too. And what does that mean? And is there a paradigm of it? Is there a paradigm of oppression that all of us can understand? In Rob Seller's identity model, he talks about sort of the dimension of being black as part of the identity, but also the dimension of being minority oppressed minority, and that you share that with other people, and that shared experience becomes a source of bonding, and that does create opportunities for understanding and ultimately for change. And I think the diversity argument is one of leverage. I think we can leverage the experiences of hundreds, thousands, millions of people to force and create change. And change is not easy to create. And I think when people don't understand how to change, they resist change altogether. And I think it's very difficult to talk about diversity, and it's very difficult to know how to change, and therefore one resists it.
Okay. I want to leave some time for Q&A, but one final question. In your work on race and racism, and you talk about implicit, explicit bias, what are your observations about what is going on in our current social political climate? What is happening with Charlottesville, with our current president? What thoughts do you have about that? This is really more an anti-Trump group, by the way.
Really? I couldn't have imagined that.
No, it's meant to
social
free you.
justice is pro-Trump. I don't get that. Anyway, well, first of all, as I said to you earlier today, it's difficult, it's complicated, and Trump is completely and totally unqualified and incapable of understanding, caring about, or doing anything about it. So that's a real problem. But worse than that, he makes it worse because of the way he thinks about it and the way he acts about it. And he's just being himself. I mean, he's always been this way. He's not different. We elected this man. We didn't elect another man who became this man. We elected this man.
How come we elected him?
We didn't.
Okay.
He was elected, or maybe he was elected. Let me put it that way. Yeah. But I do believe, I really do believe this, that we're in the throes of the end of this era. I think there are signs, there's evidence that as Eric Liu said earlier, there's more civic action and more civic involvement than for at least 50 years. So it's kind of like the civil rights era of the 60s. I think that's what's it's beginning to happen. It's going to happen. It will continue to happen. And I think Trump and his election has made that possible. And I think, ironically and surprisingly, Obama didn't really have much effect at all. And in fact, just as an aside, when Obama was elected in 2008, there was an increase of 10 times the Google searches, or the people signing up for Stormfront, the white nationalist site. and there were 4 times more searches for nigger president than there were for first black president. So if you thought that Obama's election was a post-racial event, it was clear, and the evidence was there that it was anything but. In fact, it really escalated, not decreased the racialism that existed.
You know, why don't we open it up for questions or responses from the audience? There's a microphone there, but I think you can probably speak loud enough where we don't need the microphone. Anyone care to? Yes.
You talked earlier about positive things to do to make change. So following up on this question, given where we sit right now, what do you recommend or think about things that we can do to move us forward?
You know, I'm very poor at thinking about things to do. I just think they need to be done. But I will let's see what I think. Well, first of all, and my wife and I, Olive, talk about civic issues all the time and the lack of them. I really think that the idea of educating people about what it means to be a democracy is really critical, because it is because we're a democracy that we can engage these issues. And if we're not a democracy, then these issues become harder, not easier to handle. So I think whatever you can do in whatever way you can to encourage people to understand and participate in the democracy. So that's, I think, one thing I think is very important. I think trying to think about how to affirm other people. We talk a lot. I mean, Daryl is a master of microaggressions. I mean, he's the, I don't know what you call
It's
it.
experience from my brother Stan.
Yeah, but he was probably, well, he may have been micro, but it's probably macro too. But I think what gets lost sometimes is affirmation. We really need to affirm our otherness, our personhood. And I take the Ubuntu principle from South Africa as kind of my mantra. I am, one expression of it is I am because we are. And the other is that my humanity is inextricably bound up in yours. And so I cannot be fully human if I cannot benefit from and learn from and include you in my humanity. And that to me is the ultimate. And so I think about the Truth and Reconciliation movement in South Africa, which was predicated on Ubuntu and ultimately led to the principle of forgiveness. And I think we have to somehow find a way to do that, because we do have to, I think to be successful, it has to include everybody. It can't just be us out here wailing away in the wilderness. It has to be something that everyone feels makes them better too. And that's hard to even imagine. I'm saying too long because I'm using up all the time. So let me stop. But that's all I could think of.
Back there.
Beyond color, you say? Beyond color? Beyond color blindness. That really is kind of, in many respects, the difficulty of diversity. I think color blindness is, in a sense, an excuse to privilege individualism and to marginalize collective action. So I think, but I do think that multiculturalism is not going to be accepted if multiculturalism excludes some people. And I always hate to say that because of our history, and our history says, yeah, but you excluded us, so back at you. But it's interesting if you think about Black Panther, that was kind of like the real tension there. And it was this is our humanity, and we cannot reduce it to vengefulness. And I think somehow we are the humanity, and we have to find a way to forgive, if that's a strong word and people don't like it, but it is in a sense. We have to say, I welcome you, brother, and if you are of good faith. And we have to find a way to create opportunities that really benefit all of us. And I think that really is a struggle, because we also have this sense of I've been wronged, and so I need to be taken care of. And I think that becomes I understand it, but also becomes a problem.
Okay, thank you, James.
Come on up and I'll give you informally.